Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Time 100 Talks, Time's virtual event program where we bring together leaders from all over the world and from across fields to spotlight solutions and encourage action and progress toward a better future. I'm Edward Felsenthal, Time's editor-in-chief and CEO. As we all know well by now, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating effect on public health and on lives around the planet. In addition, of course, our economy has been deeply strained and businesses are struggling to navigate this crisis, adapt to this crisis, and to the changes it has imposed on the world. Today's program explores these topics, examining the future of work and the future of business, how business leaders and policymakers can seize on this moment to create lasting positive change in the economy, in our financial systems, and in the way business operates. To discuss these topics and much more, we'll be joined by the Mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser. She will talk about the steps she's taking to lead our nation's capital out of this crisis. Eric Yuan, CEO and founder of Zoom Video Communications, is with us to discuss how companies can follow Zoom's lead and evolve as the workforce becomes more digital. We'll also be joined by Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. She'll be speaking with CNN newsroom anchor Poppy Harlow about why she remains hopeful despite the economic crisis. Slack CEO and co-founder Stuart Butterfield is with us. He'll talk about Slack's response to the pandemic and how companies can meet the moment with so many shifting to remote work. I'd also like to thank our partners at Citi for making these conversations today possible. And before we get started, I wanted to share a message from Citi's Chief Innovation Officer, Vanessa Colella. Vanessa?
At Citi, we spend time thinking about the cultural, behavioral, and technological trends that impact the future of work. During this current pandemic, we've seen all those trends accelerate. In many ways, the future is here today. In this era, companies have to think about how to increase productivity, how to improve communication, how to attract and retain an inclusive workforce, or else risk being left behind.
Now to kick us off today, I'd like to introduce Time contributor Kimberly Dozier. She'll be talking with Mayor Muriel Bowser about what's next for Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Edward. I'm Kim Dozier. I'm pleased to be joined today by the 8th Mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser. She is also the mayor of a city that she wants to turn into a state, against the wishes of the sitting president. She's the mother of a 2-year-old little girl. She is trying to restart an economy during a pandemic. And Mayor Bowser, you're also dealing with a pandemic that hits Black Americans more than others. You're also trying to do all of this against the backdrop of the pandemic. A lack of trust in government laws and the people who enforce those laws in this country. So you're probably not getting a lot of sleep, but how are you handling this?
Well, Kim, it is, I don't think anybody started this year thinking that we would be dealing with a global pandemic, have to shut down our economies. I've likened it to putting your economy in a coma. And then followed by demonstrations of the likes that we haven't seen, I think, in this country since the assassination of Martin Luther King. So that is a incredible amount to deal with, to lead through. Our residents are looking to us to provide them with information, leadership, and help get their lives as back to normal as possible as soon as possible. And that's what we're trying to do.
And yet, have been more conservative than some of the other mayors, some of the other governors. We're still in phase 1 in Washington, D.C., and you've been taking the reopening very slowly. Why is that?
Well, we've been following the data, and actually we said at the outset that we thought that the phased reopening gated criteria that was first introduced by the White House was in line with our thinking about reopening. So we have just been looking at our experience with community spread, how the virus is being transmitted, our ability to contact, trace, and isolate people who are infected. And as a result, we've blunted the curve. We have hospital capacity. We have capacity in our contact trace force. And I think that we're doing this the right way. So we won't see big spikes like what we're seeing in states across the country who reopen really quickly.
And yet, one of things that has hit DC very hard is that COVID has hit the Black and Brown community harder than other communities. That's the first time we spoke. I had just talked with the DC sanitation worker who was really worried about reopening and the impact on his team. Yep. And you talked about the virus being so efficient in the way it's attacking Black Americans. Why is that?
Well, I think what we see, first of all, is that there are more African Americans in essential roles. So they could not stay home. When we had stay-at-home orders, they were essential workers and going to work every day. And we also know that there is just a lot of the conditions that this virus is so effective against are very prevalent in the African American community. So as a mayor of a city that has almost 50% of its residents who are African American, a workforce that is largely African American, that the decisions I make really will keep African Americans alive.
And do you think that's why you haven't had much pushback on the slow reopening here? Because people understand how it's hitting their community?
Well, I would push back against calling it slow. It is according to what all of the medical and health and infectious disease experts say is reasonable to see sustained periods of decline in infection, low transmission rates, to see a trend in low test positivity. All of those make good health sense and are very reasonable ways to reopen the economy.
You have the protests over the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, names that have become carved into Americans' minds in the past several weeks. You've been mayor of DC for a long time. You were a DC native, which is a rare thing. So I know you've seen a lot of protests. What makes this different? Why is it hitting so hard now?
Well, I actually haven't seen a protest like this that feels like this in DC. And I think when you talk to other people who have lived here a long time, this has a different feeling too. It is, first of all, we're going on almost 2 weeks of demonstration activity, which is a long time for our police response. It's a long time for businesses. It's just a long time to have so much activity around protest activity. We had some people who were here early on who were destructive. And so that's also a little bit different because usually people come here, they're peaceful, oftentimes organized. And this one, I think, is very organic in that there's no real organizer. And so people are just coming because they're hurt, they're angry, and they want action. I mean, what we saw in the killing of George Floyd for 8 minutes on a video for the world to see was the worst of American policing, and people want it addressed. We have the added, I think, specter of a White House, especially in DC, who has confronted peaceful protest, and which puts a whole nother layer of community angst and anger in this equation.
Now let's talk about that clash because it's gotten pretty personal. So for you, I mean, President Donald Trump has done some name calling, and You will forever be known as the mayor who painted Black Lives Matter so large it can be seen from space outside the White House.
Yeah. For me, it's not personal. Even though I've been called names, I've been called worse by better people. But it is my responsibility to defend our city. And the federal government encroached on our autonomy. And we had to push back and push back forcefully. But I also saw it as an opportunity to reclaim a place on 16th Street that the federal government had moved into, where the federal government had release gases, whatever type of chemicals we will find out that they were on peaceful protesters, and to send a unifying and affirming message about what this time and the reaction to the killing of George Floyd means in our country.
I think a lot of people might not be aware that it got so tense between the city of DC and the White House that they actually explored taking over the DC police force, which they believed they could do. So what would you have done to stop that?
Well, what I did do to stop it was just to push back hard with every argument that I could muster. I don't have an army like they threatened us with. And there are peculiarities to our law, the Home Rule Charter, that could allow them to do it under certain circumstances. So we just pushed back very forcefully, and they backed down.
But this brings us to discussion of your push for statehood. And you've got some landmark legislation that's going to be introduced in the House.
We do. Our Congresswoman presented H.R. 51, which is the DC Statehood Admission Act. It now has more sponsors in the House than it ever has, and in fact, enough sponsors for the bill to pass. It has a record number of senators who are supporting the bill in the Senate. And we just learned yesterday that it will be up for a vote next Friday before the Congress goes on recess. So that's big news. We're going to get an affirmative vote on statehood for the first time.
It looks like it'll pass the House, but Senator Hall has said that he will not take it up on the Senate side. So if you get it passing the House, but not passing the Senate, what good does that do for the movement?
Well, I think it's a huge point of progress. And we haven't given up on the Senate, and we continue to push Senate Democrats and Republicans to get it on the floor. And that's their job. Their job is to move legislation, and we're going to continue to push for that legislation to be moved. We're clear-eyed, however, that the best opportunity for DC statehood to pass is to have a Democratic Senate and a Democrat in the White House, and be ready to push the new president to move our legislation in his first 100 days.
Sounds like you're pretty confident it won't be President Trump.
I'm hopeful, but I know that regardless, we have to be ready. And I have to have the district in the position to take advantage of the politically perfect situation.
The Black Lives Matter movement has criticized you for calling for a 3% rise in your police budget as opposed to defunding the police. I mean, why are you pushing for that? And are you doing anything to answer the demands of the protest to beef up other of government like community outreach?
Well, Kim, we are pretty blessed in Washington, D.C., because our taxpayers have allowed us to invest in our progressive values in D.C. So I would put up our city budget in terms of its investments in opportunity programs, like a 3% increase in our school funding this year. Keep in mind, we're talking about a budget where we saw $800 million billion hit because of COVID. We were able to increase our school funding, transform our infrastructure academy that trains DC residents for DC jobs. And the only new police expenditures that we have are for hiring cadets. These are DC residents that we're training to be a part of our police force who have graduated from our high schools. We've made record investments in affordable housing and ending homelessness. So the things that we do in this budget to strengthen our safety net and create opportunities are pretty robust. And what we have done with our police department over the last 5 years that I've been mayor is to make sure that we have the number of officers that we need to keep DC neighborhoods safe.
Is there anything from the protesters' demands that you have looked at and said that is worth doing? Oh, meet them halfway.
One thing I think is going to be critical for us, and I think that you're going to hear this from mayors and police chiefs across the country. We need to be able to discipline our officers without having to go through arbitration, or not having to live with binding arbitration that says that we have to keep a bad officer. So there are a lot of personnel, labor, and accountability issues that have been ingrained over the years that need to be upended. I think there's also some things that we've done. Now, keep in mind, and the part of the reason I talk about reform in this way is that DC entered a consent decree in 2002 with the Department of Justice. So for 18 years, we have been implementing reforms around use of force. We were recently checked by an independent monitor who looked at our use of force and said that MPD was exercising constitutional unbiased policing. Our council recently passed a piece of legislation that also required us to look at our stop data in a systematic way and report it out every year, or actually every 6 months. And we're doing that as well, so that we're constantly evolving how we police. One of the questions is that this data show is that more Black people are stopped than their white counterparts. So why is that? Are we able to find out anything about our calls for service, or in that information that tells us and helps us evolve our force so we know that it's more fair?
How much more could you do if you didn't have the police union to work with and through? Are they standing in the way?
Well, they have a job to do for their members. And I think that they also have an interest in not having bad police on the force, or not have police that are violating their orders and guidance and hurting somebody. So I think our interests are the same there. And quite frankly, that's the work that we have to do with them to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we want to respect labor rights, but we also need to make sure that people that aren't keeping communities safe, that are making it harder for all of the members to do their jobs, aren't on our forces.
Moving back to the theme of the Time 100 talks, we've been looking at the future of work and looking at the COVID pandemic and asking, is this a new era? Will we now be mostly working from home? But you've also got the special set of circumstances, such a large Black community in DC, of bringing business back in a way that helps minority communities. So when you look ahead to the future, how is the pandemic going to change how you help those businesses?
Well, I think the pandemic is going to change everything about work. I think that the teleworking has taken on and taken hold in a way that I, quite frankly, didn't expect. I think that a lot of people are functioning pretty well remotely. So I think that's a good thing. I think another divide has been not revealed is the wrong word, but exacerbated by this pandemic, and that's the digital divide. So I think we're going to have huge opportunities to make sure that more people are connected. I think we have huge opportunities in our learning environment to see what has worked. One question I ask every time I meet with my cabinet is, what about this shutdown? What about this pandemic response has been good for your agency and the work that you do? And some things are big things and some things are small things, but every director to a person has said that some part of the modified operation that we're in as a government has been good for their organization and the way they deliver services. So we're going to be able to call all of those good things and figure out what works best. And I think that can only be to the benefit of our vulnerable communities in DC, which the government spends a large proportion of its time and resources serving.
Is there a specific way that things have been better that they've shared with you?
A number of things, from some of the remote processing that MPD does with the courts, other learners in our public education system. I think that having individualized learning on pace for them has been helpful for some kids. It's been totally unhelpful for others, but there is a proportion of the kids that it has worked for. A number of us like the formats for some of the video meetings that we've done. From a community input perspective, I think that, and this is kind of counterintuitive, but more people have participated in some community meetings online than you would ever see in person. So I think that there's a lot of ways even that we're going to think about how we communicate and meet with our constituents.
I've noticed at your press conferences, you have all of your staff members there and you frequently bring them into the conversation. And these people reflect the ethnic breakdown of Washington, D.C. It's very diverse.
Thank you.
So that leads me to question, a lot of CEOs across the United States are looking at their employees and saying, do I have a diverse makeup of employees? And they're asking some tough questions and starting some awkward conversations. How do you start those awkward conversations?
Well, I don't see them as awkward. I think that organizations are best served and best run with a diversity of opinions. So people from all different backgrounds, beliefs, race and ethnicity, ability, all make for better decision making. I also think it's very important, and I'm in government, so this may be a little different than the private sector, but people want to see themselves reflected in their leadership. And so we are very intentional when we are recruiting. That we are recruiting diverse candidates and that we're hiring the best of the best. Now, I feel very proud. One thing that I'm proud of as a manager of 37,000 people is that people want to work in DC government. And so we are recruiting just outstanding people, and they know that their work will be rewarded here. And that's why we have a diverse workforce.
Does that just mean casting a wider net?
Sometimes it means casting a wider net. Other times you have to dig deeper. One area that I know that we have to do better on is we don't get as many applicants with disabilities for jobs at all levels. So we are really thinking about how we are going to do better at recruiting and identifying people to come work for us. We don't recruit as many Latino males. Why? I'm not sure, but we are thinking about how we can go about recruiting outstanding candidates at all levels.
We're just ahead of Juneteenth. How would you advise Americans mark Juneteenth?
Well, I think a lot of Americans are just now learning about Juneteenth. And so I want them to reflect on what that really means, that enslaved people built this country uncompensated for a lot of years and then suffered through Jim Crow and every anti-discrimination measure that you can, every discriminatory measure you can think of, and what it means for them to celebrate Juneteenth all those months after the Emancipation Proclamation, and how devastating that is. But what's really devastating is the effects of that are still so prominent in the African American experience. Now, we're different in DC in another way, and you won't frequently hear a lot of talk about Juneteenth in DC, is because we, of course, in DC celebrate Emancipation Day. And slaves in the District of Columbia were emancipated before the Emancipation Proclamation. And so this year we didn't have our Emancipation Day celebration, which is April 16th because of COVID, but we have a very proud history in DC of celebrating that day, which is a tradition that goes back a long ways.
So the last question I'd like to bring up is your daughter, Miranda. I got to see her when you came out to visit one of the COVID testing sites you've set up in really hard-hit communities. And it was her 1-year birthday. She just had a lot of cake. So she was 2 years. It was 2 years. Yeah. Okay. So she just had a lot of birthday cake. So she was really good for about 5 minutes. And then you could tell like the sugar hit.
All right.
So what do you hope for her will come out of this moment? And what are your hopes for this moment in America?
Well, for her, and she's she's 2 years old, so she's not in school yet. And her life has been somewhat impacted because her activities aren't happening right now. But I want her to be proud of her city. I want her to be proud of her mom, and I want her to inherit a different city, one that is a state, one where she could aspire to be a senator, one where the way we deliver government services is fair, and that we're closing gaps and disparities that have been shown by COVID and by the disparate treatment of African Americans by police. So I feel very strongly that the work that we're doing is for Miranda and her little colleagues that are going to inherit the city from us.
Would you advise her to go into politics?
I would advise her to go into politics. You better believe it. But I want her to fulfill her heart's desire, not mine.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser, for your time and your insight. In a moment, we'll be joined by Time Senior Editor Haley Sweetland Edwards, who will be in conversation with Zoom CEO and founder Eric Yuan about the evolving future of the more digital workforce.
A meal is more than just food. It's comfort, hope, and for many, a livelihood. That's why Citi is partnering with World Central Kitchen, who have transformed the way we feed our communities during the pandemic. By connecting people who need meals with restaurant and delivery workers who need to earn a living, they can help struggling restaurants and fight hunger at the same time.
Hi, I'm Haley Sweetland Edwards, and I'm glad to be joined today by the CEO and founder of Zoom, Eric Yuan. Thanks so much for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So, Zoom, let's just start with the obvious. In December, Zoom had 10 million daily participants, and in April, it had 300 million. That's a 30-fold increase, and the result, of course, of COVID and the way it transformed all of our lives. But why do you think it was Zoom that captured the public's attention instead of, I don't know, Google or Skype or one of the other entrenched players?
So we started a company in 2011, and our employee, we were just laser focusing on video collaboration. We worked so hard over the past several years to build a frictionless collaboration experience. I think as a pandemic spread globally, Zoom usage ballooned overnight and far surpassing any projections we could have ever imagined, because this service just works, very easy to use, great quality.
So those people who were using Zoom 6 months ago as a business meeting platform, and recently it's become an everything platform. My friend got married on Zoom recently. We had our son's birthday on Zoom. There are religious services on Zoom. Does that make you think about the product that you founded differently?
I think one use case I'm so proud is Zoom marriage is legal in New York. When we started, we focused on business customers, enterprise customers, but now we truly open it up to so many first-time users, a lot of brand new use cases. We feel very proud. We really care about every user. So that's why we are working harder and harder to serve all different use cases now.
So obviously this has just been a massive global paradigm shift, and that comes with all kinds of opportunities, as we've talked about, but also challenges. And one of the biggest challenges is security. After initially considering offering end-to-end encryption only to paid users, Zoom just announced that the technology will be an advanced add-on for everybody. So how did your thinking evolve on that?
So first of all, our company culture is to deliver happiness. We really care about our customers. We listen to our customer feedback, very carefully. So initially, when we talk about end-to-end encryption, by the way, it is just an advanced feature. So by default, we use the AES 256 GCM encryption. And however, we would like to offer an advanced option, essentially to give you end-to-end encryption. But with that, some features you cannot use it, like you cannot use a phone to dial in. Our initial thought is only to give the paid users because we cannot identify who those free users are. But based on the feedback, we figured out a way to identify those free users, meaning you can use your phone number or SMS verification. With that, we can offer this advanced feature to all users. This is another example. We are very, very committed to listening to our customer feedback and make a change to deliver happiness to our users.
So is that starting now, or are you rolling it out in stages?
Yes, in July, we are going to start offering beta to our customers, meaning when we offer the beta, free users, pro, and paid enterprise customer, they all will get that feature as one advanced functionality.
So one of the things that, it's true of cybersecurity always, but that the good guys are always trying to keep a step ahead of the bad guys. But, the world, financial institutions, governments moving online, this has been and using your platform has been just a major boon for the bad guys. The term Zoom bombers has entered our lexicon. Should users expect privacy when they engage in a Zoom conversation?
Absolutely, because Zoom was built to serve very big, large enterprise customers. Actually, we have lots of great security features already built in. Normally, the way for us to work together with our enterprise customers is to work together with enterprise CIO or head of IT to enable, disable some features with a special security configuration and Zoom have an onboarding process before the customers, they started using Zoom. During this pandemic crisis, we have so many first-time users. And we, even if we have all those security features, they may not know it. That's why we listen to our customer carefully. We enforced a lot of security features by default, like a password, a waiting room, disable some features. And for the very sensitive meetings, we can enable meeting registration as well. So essentially, because we care about the customers, that's why we double down on our privacy and security effort. We even decided to freeze any new features for 90 days. To really care about our users.
So for 90 days, you're freezing new features and focusing exclusively on security. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, security and privacy. I give one example. Some features that were built for serving a lot of enterprise customers, it worked very well over the past several years. But when it comes to first-time consumers, you might have a privacy, violation, right? So we need to disable those features. So again, we are going to leverage this 90 days time window to review every process, every the business practice, to make sure everywhere, every corner, we are very secure. There's no any potential privacy issues for the first-time consumers.
And for first-time consumers, these are things that my 70-year-old parents are not going to have to know how to opt into. They will just exist on the platform as is.
Right on, including my kids, that they are using Zoom for the K-12's online training session as well. And almost everyone can use Zoom because there's so many different use cases when you work from home now.
Right, absolutely. So speaking of so many Zoom cases, as we discussed, people are using this platform for everything. People have multiple Zoom meetings a day. And I've heard for the first time recently the phrase Zoom burnout. Is that something that's come up in your headquarters? And what do you think that users can do to prevent and combat that?
That's great. Yes, quite often when you work from home, guess what? You might have more meetings. And very often you might have a Zoom fatigue, right? I think we got to, first of all, we got to be aware of this issue, and we got to have a process. And also here, like we always share with our employees, you got to relax. And also we also work together with American Heart Association, right, to help those users and make sure always relax. Take a break, and from a computer, right? Spend more time with your family, with your loved ones, and also we have a hashtag, take a break. I think we do all we can to make sure customers, they feel comfortable, even if they have several hours, the video sessions like Zoom.
Mm-hmm. So Zoom is working with the American Heart Association. Is that what you said?
Yes, exactly.
To do what?
So we work together to promote, how to relax and how to care about those users. Because when you work from home for too long time, you might have anxiety, depression. What's the best practice to help those users?
Mm-hmm. Is there a single, you said step away, spend time with family. Is there a strategy that you use personally? I imagine you spend quite a bit of time on Zoom calls.
Yeah, so in between Zoom calls, I always, go to my backyard and take a walk to think and relax a little bit. I try to not have too many back-to-back meetings. That's very important.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk about, COVID-19 forever transforming our workplaces. Now that we've gone work from home, we're never going to go back, or at least a lot of the millions of white collar jobs that people can do from the computer. What do you think is the biggest challenge that employers will have to overcome while becoming less tied to physical workplaces?
I think that, first of all, you needed to give employees a very good, consistent tools to make sure there's no productivity loss, make sure always connected, also very secure, right? That's number one thing. Number two things, you got to spend a little bit more time to engage with your remote employees. quite often they cannot see each other. Even with video conferencing can help a little bit, but you still cannot replace that experience with a face-to-face meeting. And also you need to do more. As every business leaders, you got to spend more time, engage with your employees, do more surveys to really understand, listen to their feedback, and do all you can to care about every employee.
So globally, talked a little bit about the US, but globally there's many challenges to what we think of in America as the cornerstone of our country, the freedom of speech. And many US based tech companies have struggled to reconcile their commitment to free speech with a global platform. In a June press release, I believe, Zoom announced plans for their technology, for Zoom, to be to comply with local restrictions in different countries, including those imposed by the Chinese government and elsewhere, and block individuals from participating in meetings based on location. Can you tell me about that decision, how you arrived at it?
Yeah, first of all, we serve and for almost more than 80 countries, and because this is the first time global video collaboration, right? Almost users coming from all over the world, and they use Zoom. On the one hand, we needed to make sure comply with the local laws. On the other hand, you are so right. We are an American company. We truly promote free speech. And now actually we do all we can to look at if there's a conflict. We want to make sure and we stick to our value, rather than just for the revenue opportunity. On the one hand, we want to make sure every user is happy. On the other hand, we do all we can to promote free speech. This is very important. That's our value.
Mm-hmm. So when Zoom made the decision to comply with local restrictions, including those imposed by governments that don't respect free speech, it was on the grounds that having the platform would be better than not having it? Or what was the grounds of that decision?
So essentially, recently, we hired a lot of people, also the third-party consultant, a lot of, the companies, and also we talk with, try to help us as well. Essentially, you see, like there's some local laws, right? You see, like you can block the participant from that specific country to join. However, also we also have our value, right? No matter what, like a CSAM, probably we help with the local enforcement because the child, safety is very important. If any other things, we are not going to collaborate because this is different. We open and we promote free and open speech, and they can only block the participant from the specific country to join. Other than that, we do not do anything because this is our company's value.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what responsibility, if any, do you and other tech leaders who oversee communication platforms have to political speech in particular? Do you feel, is that something you think about on a daily basis?
Yeah, so again, I'm more like engineer over the past many years, really focus on product, but I learned a lot recently, and also study now. I also personally will get involved and learn a lot of things about this. I think like a political speech, open speech is part of the, this is freedom, right? I think we should promote that, right? That's why I say, we do all we can, right? To make sure build a very scalable platform, let the people all over the world, to use Zoom. However, if some countries they wanted to block, participants to join, unfortunately, that's out of our control. And but again, we are not going to do anything. You just can block those participants, and that's it. But we also try to convince everyone in the world, for the open speech, always use Zoom as long as you do not give this to terrorists, right, to use Zoom, and don't give the bad actors to use Zoom.
So speaking of values, and I hear you that you're an engineer and you're thrust into the middle of these larger geopolitical and sort of philosophical questions, but we're in the middle of a transformative moment here in the United States, and many companies, including Zoom, have put out statements about their support for social justice. What role, in your opinion, does Silicon Valley have to play in these conversations about social change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Zoom recently hired Damien Hooper Campbell to be our first chief diversity officer. And he's going to lead the design and implementation of Zoom's global diversity and inclusion strategy. It's very important, right? You have a culture where you embrace diversity and inclusion. And also he will help Zoom, to build on our efforts to date, including a company-wide inclusion, training program and employee resources groups. I think every high-tech companies, I think we take that very, very seriously, right? And I think we should be on the forefront of this, to focus on justice, do all we can to care about the community, to care about the society, make our community and society a much better place with more justice. Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, the first ever chief diversity officer, what are his action items that he's putting in place at Zoom? Is there anything actionable that you guys can take control of?
Yeah. So, first of all, and he's, he already organized some meetings, listen to our employees. We invited all of our employees from from Black community and sit down, listen to them, read and stand. The first is and listen and stand. And also he's going to help us, to build a program or strategy, how we can do better, right? For more inclusion, a more diversified employee base as well. And also he's also responsible for establishing Zoom's university recruiting program and initiatives, right? We should hire more and more engineers and more from universities with a diversified background. We are very excited, with his guidance.
So Zoom, you founded Zoom in 2011, I believe. It's a relatively young company. You have been on, the last 6 months must have felt like an absolute roller coaster for you. Was there a moment where you just thought maybe you were, having a dream?
Yeah, every day when I wake up, I always think about one thing: how to make sure our employee happy, how to make sure our customer happy. Because this is is a time where we truly feel proud. How to help people stay connected. Suddenly you feel like you are working so hard on something. Your dream is started coming true. That's why no matter what, I feel very excited. I'm fully recharged every day. It feels like you're part of the big dream is going to come true.
And what about 10 years from now? That age-old question. What is Zoom in 10 years? Is it still a video platform, do you think?
We believe that video collaboration or conferencing service like Zoom can deliver a better experience than face-to-face meetings. Imagine a world where in 10 years, maybe 15 years, you and I have a call. Maybe any two person in the world, they can have a call. They can speak a different language with AI real-time language translation. And the first time I have a meeting, I want to give you a hug, and you feel my hug and handshaking, virtual handshaking, and you're drinking the coffee. We can support digitalizing the smell. I can enjoy the smell remotely. I think that those cool features will truly enrich the video collaborating experience. You will feel like you really do not need to get it together physically. That's the word. That's why we are very excited. We are not there yet, but the future is bright.
Do you think that that future of us being able to shake each other's hands virtually and speak other languages to each other and hear each other in our own language, do you think that's 10 years away?
Maybe 15, but someday it will for sure will happen. So,
wow. Well, that's a vision for the future. Eric Yuan, an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be here with us.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Haley, and thank you, Eric Yuan, for your time today. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Poppy Harlow, CNN Newsroom anchor and host of the podcast Boss Files with Poppy Harlow. She'll be joined by the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, for a conversation about the economic downturn and why she remains optimistic.
Edward, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being with us today. It's quite an honor that we have a chance to speak to the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. Such an important time, Madam Managing Director. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
You know, this really seems like your moment that you were meant to lead. So much of your fight, so much of your upbringing has been around equality and being a voice for the most poor in countries and for the most poor countries. You spoke about this crisis as a crisis like no other in a speech you gave not long ago. And you wrote on LinkedIn earlier this month, a crisis often brings out the best in people. This is happening already. You are approaching this from a position of optimism, and I'm hoping you can tell us why.
Well, it is really a crisis like no other. It is massive with great deal of uncertainty, truly global. We have now 170 countries finishing 2020 with smaller economies than they started the year. But it is also response like no other. And I would say opportunity like no other. In terms of response, what we have seen is remarkable. In very short period of time, countries lifted up their fiscal measures to prevent people, especially the most vulnerable, falling into the midst of this crisis in despair. And central banks have poured enormous amount of liquidity. All of this has put a floor under the economy that we consciously, like never before, put on standstill. These actions have been well coordinated within countries and actually well coordinated among countries. And they benefited not only their direct recipients, but also they had positive spillover impact for emerging economies. And let me give you one example. In March, I was so worried of what I have seen as outflows of capital from developing countries. Yeah. $100 billion leaving in weeks. In April and May, countries could go back to markets, raise money because of this abundance of liquidity. But only countries with good fundamentals. This is one earring that we are putting from the crisis. Do the right thing in good times so you can face bad times. Sure. And then why I think of the crisis also as an opportunity. Because we will have to put into action massive fiscal stimulus to revitalize economies everywhere. And when we do that, it is our chance to make it so that the world on the other side is greener. In other words, we invest in the right things, in a low carbon, climate resilient growth. It is smarter. We make sure that digital is for everybody. It is not just for you and me and the privileged in advanced economies. And most importantly, that it is fairer, that we put distributional impact as we move forward in a way that protects our society from the most terrible scarring, the scarring of poverty and inequality. And I hear in many countries, Europe, New Zealand, in some developing countries, voices that say, yes, we can do it. We can make this to be the great revival of our times, rather than the great reversal that it may risk to be.
That's a great way to put it, the great revival, not the great reversal. And you say we can do it. What must we do? What must the US do as a leading economy in this? And what must the global economy do to make sure that we come out of this not the same on the other side, but in fact more equal. I mean, you for so long have been a fighting voice for gender equality. Melinda Gates told me a few weeks ago how concerned she is that this COVID crisis will set women back further. And the data is already showing that it is affecting women more. More of the housework, the childcare is falling on women. There is concern that when we do go back to work, if you will, many women won't be able to go back if there's not adequate childcare. How do we ensure that it is more equitable on the other side?
Well, we can only do it if we are focused on the policy measures that put in place will shift us in the right direction. It is not going to fall from the sky. And we know what these policy measures ought to be. One, we know that for us to be in a better place, growth has to resume. We are not going to have a more prosperous world if we fail to inject this critical momentum of growth that is not only happening, but is happening in a more inclusive manner. In other words, pay attention to the small and medium size companies. Make sure they don't go massively in bankruptcy. Protecting the vibrancy of the economy is truly paramount for everybody. But then make the second step. Think about measures that can gear us towards more equality. One of these measures, we know it, is how we spread the responsibilities for our future. Let me give you one example in this crisis. Digital is definitely the winner. By any standard, it looks like the digital transformation is being accelerated by the pandemic. Some experts say possibly by 2 or more years. Well, if digital is the big winner, how is this winner going to help that we don't have parts of our society falling behind? We have to think about the role of taxation in a world in which parts of the economy are going to do much better. And we know that we have people that do much better. But then also how we put the right incentives for companies to be inclusive for women, for people of different minorities out there. We know that this issue of inequality in the US, it is right now about racial inequality, but it is broader than that. And we know that we have learned what are the policies that can be put in place for the world to be more inclusive. And last but not least, let's not forget that together, more integrated, we do much better. There is one worry on my mind, which is the fate of trade in the post is still early to say, but in this world out there, we ought to protect our ability to get richer because we collaborate economically and we trade with each other. It's so simple. The lesson of history is so simple. When we trade, costs of what we produce go down, incomes go up, and poverty retreats.
Sure. I mean, the US has seen the example when you talk about the Great Depression and how it was exacerbated by increased tariffs and Smoot-Hawley and increased protectionism. And you've been warning for a while now against that increased protectionism. I'd like to talk about equality and build on that a bit, because we all know every study shows if you have more diverse boards and more diverse leadership, meaning, equal number of women and a minority employment at the top and on the board that actually reflects the society in which your corporation operates, they do better, right? But that's not what we have. And the discussion I'm having with CEOs now constantly every day on our program is, so what are you going to do about it? Ursula Burns, the first Black woman to run a Fortune 500 company, Xerox, told me she is fielding calls left and right from white men leading companies asking her what to do. They have the power to make these changes. You're in favor of quotas. it's controversial, but you think we're at that point where we need quotas for diversity?
I'm very much in favor of something that drives accountability for diversity. You can call it quotas, you can call it targets, you can call it goals. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is discipline to measure where we are making progress in the direction of diversity. The reason I personally am in favor of setting a quota at senior management level is that unless you get the top of an organization to look like the world, it is very difficult to lift up the bottom. And it is so doable. I was in the European Commission, we call it target. Okay, let's use this softer word, target, 40% women in senior management, when the percentage was around 4-5. And my first meeting on this topic, my staff gave me 15-minute presentation as to why this cannot be done. Cannot be done, too difficult. So I sent them back. I said, very interesting. Now go back and come with a presentation that tells us how it is going to be done, because it will be done. And Poppy, it is done. So that determination, leadership determination, means to not zero on obstacles except for the purpose of overcoming them.
Mm. I like that. I like that approach. Go back and tell me why you can do it. I'm going to try that. I'd like to spend a bit of time focusing on solutions in your mind. We're seeing it play out in the streets of America right now, but this is a global crisis in terms of racism and racial inequality and what we're maybe finally going to do about it. When you look at the numbers out of the Federal Reserve just in the United States from just a few years ago, 2016, the median net worth of a white household was 10 times that of a Black household. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where this all began with the killing of George Floyd. And I grew up seeing the disparity there that is replicated across the country. And I wonder what solutions you think there are to that from the ground level up, not just elevating minorities, which we need to do in corporate America, but what else is our responsibility at this point?
Well, it is our responsibility to recognize the value of diversity and make sure that we talk about this value of diversity in all possible matrices. For me, in my job, it is the economics of diversity. Why is it that more diverse societies, companies do better? And show it relentlessly, stay on message, repeat it as many times as it would take for the message to sink in. We also have a huge responsibility to recognize that inequality, exclusion, it affects everybody. Even the people who are doing well are doing less well because the society so stupidly doesn't tap into the talent of all its people. And of course, the social fabric is impacted in a way that certainly diminishes our quality of life. And I am more in favor of making this case not just on the basis of values, although values matter. Who we are matters, but to make it in a way that people can say, oh, this is actually good for me, even if I am from the privileged minority. Longer term, I'm better off if society is inclusive. And the research of the IMF is very interesting in this regard. We have shown that more inequality, all other things equal, actually damages growth prospects, and in the end is a cost that one way or another societies bear.
Could you speak to the poorer nations out there and about our responsibility for emerging economies. For people who don't know, you're the first person from an emerging market economy to lead the IMF. And you have a unique perspective on this, watching your mother, for example, in the 90s lose her wealth, her savings overnight in the currency crisis. I mean, we have seen actions, we have seen the suspension of debt service payments to these countries, but it's going to take a long time. I mean, if the Federal Reserve is saying we're not going to get back to normal for a matter of years here, and that's the United States, for emerging economies, I think it may be even more protracted.
Yeah. Well, I take my origins, where I come from, extremely seriously as part of my responsibility in this crisis to have not only analytical understanding of problems countries and people face, but also empathy and emotional understanding, and making sure that my institution leans forward with everything we have, especially to support the most vulnerable. Poppy, in 7 weeks, we have provided 70 financial lifelines to countries that so much need it. And this has never happened in the history of the IMF. And as we have done it, normally we would have complicated story of conditionalities. This time, we ask only 2 things. Please pay your doctors, your nurses, make sure your hospitals work, and please help the most vulnerable parts of your economy and your most vulnerable people. When I look at the future that affects all of us, the uncertainty within which we operate, but the future that is going to be, it would take time for us to rebound fully. We are projecting 2021 only partial recovery from this crisis. Of course, I worry about the countries and the people that are least suited, and therefore what we do is to mobilize attention to these people. And I want to praise the United States in the $2 trillion package that Congress approved. There were also components to make the IMF stronger, to give more resources to development banks. And that is formidable. We have to do more of this, acts of solidarity. And then my job is to make sure that the taxpayers' money, the country's own and those that come in support, they are targeting a more productive, pro-growth, but also pro-poor development. You said when we come back to where we were, I actually hope that we will build forward, that the future would be fixing some of the problems we had in our past.
I certainly hope so too, especially for the little ones you see behind me. My 2- and 4-year-old, I hope that they are in a world that is not the same now, but more equitable, certainly. Let's talk about that in a more holistic approach, if you would. Not just financial targets and getting GDP back to where it was pre-COVID crisis, but is there a value in economic policy makers prioritizing more holistic targets, right? Like social and environmental targets. You talked about a greener world, and not just growth targets.
Definitely. We have to think of sustainable and inclusive growth for the future. Sustainable meaning that we recognize our Earth is not unlimited, and the pressures we have put, especially in terms of climate change, unsustainable. For those who don't like the pandemic, you're not going to like the climate crisis either. It would be destructive to a point that may reverse poverty dramatically. I actually see that as a critical objective of the growth of the future, to be one that is low carbon and climate resilient. And we also have to think of growth as being smart in a sense that it is based on investing in the most precious capital we have, which is us, investing in people, education, healthcare, social protection. These are not feel-good spendings. These are hardcore investments if we are to have an economy, strong economy to rely on. When we had the global financial crisis, as you remember, at that time, we zeroed on the banking sector and we actually fixed it. We now have banking system that is much more resilient, stronger buffers, better performance, and it helps us in this crisis. Looking into the lessons from the pandemic, we sure have to recognize that having automatic social protection stabilizers is critically important. Having a health system that would prevent from another shock, hugely expensive in the future, but also having education that creates equality of opportunities for all children, for yours, for my granddaughter and my grandson, who I want to see growing in a world that is prosperous, sustainable, fair.
Well, and on the education front, because I agree, it is the most formidable crisis that we face. And it's not one that my children face and your grandchild faces. We have the means to provide the education that they need. I worry about so many kids now that because they don't have connection to broadband aren't even learning when school is not in session, let alone getting proper nutrition. You brought up the banking sector, and I guess I would just end on this because, we stood up the banking sector in the United States in the financial crisis, and we said there will be stress tests. And if you are not prepared for them, and if you cannot sustain yourself, you cannot stay in business. But we haven't done that for the education sector. What if there was that bar and that test for every school in this country and around the world to say, you must meet these standards to educate our children? I wonder how you think about solutions for education that has been arguably the most formidable challenge.
One, I take pride that the IMF invented stress testing for the banking system, and now you are challenging us to think how to stress test for quality of human capital. I would take that. I accept the challenge, Poppy. Right. Two, what we see in different parts of the world paints a picture of where we should go. If you take the top 10 countries in PISA, 8 of them are from Asia. Sorry, 7 of them are from Asia. At the top are countries that have taken education of children extremely seriously, and that they put that quality, not just quantity, quality of education at the top of their priority list. And there are countries that are doing better on many other indicators. It is actually very depressing in my part of the world, in Europe, to have 20% of the 15-year-old to be basically illiterate and innumerical in Europe. In my country, Bulgaria, long traditions of education being a priority, even worse, some almost 40%. That cannot be a foundation for development in a digital, automated, very fast-moving world. And therefore, we do have to put stress tests for how is our educational system developing. And as I said, embraced, I will, when I come next to you, we will talk about that. How can it be done?
I appreciate that. I look forward to us meeting in person one day. And I'm very grateful. I think we all are for your leadership now at the IMF. As I said, I think you are the right person and you were born for this moment in the world. So thank you so much, Madam Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva. We really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. In a moment, we'll be joined by Time Deputy Editor Sam Jacobs. He will be with Stuart Butterfield, who is the CEO and co-founder of something I think we're all using a lot more of now, and that is Slack. They'll have a conversation about Slack's role in the rapidly evolving digital workplace. Look forward to that. My thanks to all of you.
A meal is more than just food. It's comfort, hope, and for many, a livelihood. That's why Citi is partnering with World Central Kitchen, who have transformed the way we feed our communities during the pandemic. By connecting people who need meals with restaurant and delivery workers who need to earn a living, they can help struggling restaurants and fight hunger at the same time.
Work today is changing faster than ever. One of the companies behind that transformation, Slack. I'm joined today by Slack CEO and Time 100 honoree, Stuart Butterfield. Stuart, this is a conversation about the future of work, but I want to first start by looking at the recent past. Let's go back a few weeks and look at what happened in March. Slack, like lots of companies, was scrambling to operate while the coronavirus lockdown was shutting down its offices. At the exact same time, Slack saw record usage rates. Take us back and explain what that week felt like.
It's funny, we have a board meeting coming up this Friday, and I realized that the last meeting we had in an office was Thursday, March 6th. That could be slightly off on the date, but it was definitely a Thursday. And after the board meeting had ended, we got informed by one of our employees that the CDC had contacted them and said that they were potentially exposed. Now, thankfully, they weren't infected in the end, but because of that, we decided to shut down our office for the day and do a deep cleaning over the weekend. But in the 72 hours between that decision and Monday, everything changed. We decided that we were going to close offices and everyone was going to work from home. So it's just really incredible how fast that happened. In the couple of weeks that followed that, huge rush of adrenaline inside the company. Obviously, there's a lot of anxiety for employees and for customers and for everyone, both about the health impact and the economic impact. But meanwhile, we were facing this real increasing usage. I think the positive part of it was in those moments of crisis, I think humans have a really strong instinct to try to be of help. They want to be of service. And there was an opportunity for our employees to actually pitch in there. There was record numbers of people writing in with questions. We started doing one-on-one consultations with anyone who wanted it. And I think that gave us really something to do that took our minds off of the anxiety and allowed us to better serve our customers.
How does it feel when the fate of the world and the fate of your company seem to be moving in opposite directions?
It's really interesting. I was born in 1973, so that was stagflation. My father was a real estate developer, and so in 1982, when interest rates went to 18%, like every other real estate developer in the world, he went bankrupt. I graduated from high school into a pretty bad recession in the early 90s. I worked at dot-com crash. I personally held shares in Lehman Brothers over the weekend that they went bankrupt. And I've been through a number of these cycles. The severity and the asymmetry of the economic impact is really interesting here. So, obviously a lot of businesses felt it upfront, travel, hospitality. Some businesses, I guess, like ours, actually saw an increase in customer activity and in sales. And then a lot that were kind of neutral. And I don't think we see the true impact show up until it trickles down. So while we're 100% occupied with, serving customers, improving the product, and all the things that we should be doing to operate the business, there is a lot of uncertainty, and human beings hate uncertainty. But both customers, investors, employees, I'm no different. So really trying to hold on to the things that we are certain about and to try to make decisions as quickly as we can when we have the available information. It's kind of a different mode of working and a different way of operating.
What are your customers telling you today about the state of the economy? Can you share a little bit about their view and what that tells you about the future?
Well, we have 122,000 customers, so and they're all around the world. Some of them, as small businesses, have either gone bankrupt or at least kind of shut down for the time being. We've seen, on the one hand, enterprise customers who are proceeding much more aggressively and making decisions much more quickly to adopt the platform. And on the other side, people who are trying to defer some decision making, starting to see some kind of lockdowns on budgets and spending. And then for the vast majority, who are obviously small and medium businesses, this is starting to see like a less expansion, or the expansion that we would have normally anticipated happening across all customer cohorts doesn't show up in the same way. So the signal seems like where there aren't layoffs, there are hiring freezes. Customers are not growing as quickly. And when our customers feel pain, we also feel that same pain.
Have you considered, perhaps when the lockdown ends, keeping your offices permanently closed?
I don't think permanently closed, but definitely a real shift in how we work, and the number of employees who would be remote, and the degree of flexibility for those employees who live in a city where we have an office, about how much they come in. And I think that's good, and I think it presents a lot of opportunities. But I also almost feel like we don't have a choice, because we exist in a market for talent, and so many of our peers have already announced that they're going to allow people to work remotely, that they're going to have some flexibility. So maybe you come into the office for sequential days, but then don't come back for 2 weeks. Maybe you come into the office once or twice a week, but work from home other times. And you can imagine, like, if every one of the people with whom we compete for talent has said that, and we instead say, well, at Slack, we're going to insist and require you to come into the office. First of all, we would not be, we would limit ourselves to a much smaller pool of candidates. Even those candidates in the cities where we do have offices, so Vancouver, New York, and Toronto, and Denver, and the Bay Area, London, Dublin, Tokyo, and Osaka, those people who want the optionality or have made the decision they would like to move in the future, because a lot of people have decided, I want to be near family, or I want to, I'm sick of living in an apartment. We would lose out on those. And finally, for existing employees, there's plenty of Slack employees who are in that same position. We would risk losing them. So it's really, there's an interesting kind of game theory here. Again, I support this decision, and I think it'll be long-term beneficial to the company, but there is a sense in which we don't have a choice.
You've said in the past that Slack is made for this moment. Is this because of what you see as the future of a more kind of hybrid working model?
It's less, Slack is not designed for remote work specifically, although I think it's really helpful. But the transition itself, the kind of disruption, the kind of dislocating effect of working in one way and then suddenly working in another, is actually the thing that Slack is made for. So in our S1, the document we file with the SEC on the path to going public, we said something like, in a world with an increased pace of technological change that drives change in consumer behavior, which drives change in markets, and globalization that leads to a lot more dynamic economic environment, the challenge, I guess, that is common to all organizations is the ability to achieve some kind of agility, or that starts with alignment. And if you're able to create that alignment over time in a dynamic environment, then you can be agile enough to be successful. And that's what we think we offer. So that's not out of the box. You don't start using Slack and suddenly you're more agile, but it's the most effective tool or instrument for both employees and for leaders to create that kind of agility. So when I said made for this moment, part of that was, the customer orientation of the company and our ability to really step up and be helpful. And part of it was, this is, the most disruptive period in the history of American business, probably.
The most disruptive.
Yeah, or certainly, it's hard to rank them, but certainly it's close. And I think a lot of people are discovering the advantages of taking all the conversations that were happening across the organization, but in inboxes where they're kind of partial and fragmented and not organized in any real way, and moving those into channels. You create a channel for everything that's happening across the company, And then suddenly everyone knows where to go to ask their question. Everyone knows where to go to give their update. Everyone knows where to go to get caught up in something. And that has a huge impact when you're working in the office, and obviously, of course, when you're working remotely. So we had 100,000 plus customers before any of this happened, and they all got value when they were mostly working in the office. And we expect that people, to the extent that they go back completely or kind of partially, the benefits will still be there. But let me put it this way: I guess there's a lot of industries that were disrupted. Media is probably the most extreme example. Retail, but just the technological changes have had such a huge impact. They've been relatively localized to like the industry where the technology had this impact. Now everyone's experiencing this all at once. Like JP Morgan, 280,000 employees, suddenly they're not going to offices anymore. And logistics, shipping, wholesale, retail, healthcare, financial services, just like everything goes through this really tumultuous change. The positive thing, I guess, to take away is with every challenge, there's an opportunity. And for Slack as a company, not the product or the business, we're really trying to take this as an opportunity to reinvent and reimagine how we manage, how we operate, how we report on the business, how we make decisions, how those decisions are communicated. Because I think a lot of that is just, it's evolved over the course of decades. It's kind of, there's a standard way of doing things that isn't really ever examined. And having the option or the time or the position to really examine those and imagine how we can do things better is exciting.
Inside that opportunity is a real change for, among other things, work-life balance. I came to visit you in 2015 just as Slack was a year into its business, and this company that was supposed to be out there, as many people said, killing email. And I'm curious what you think about what has changed. When we talked then, we talked about how unhealthy our relationship was to technology. I'm afraid our relationship to technology has only gotten worse in the last 5 years. Do you fear at all that Slack adds to that problem?
No, I don't. So no, I don't fear that Slack adds to the problem. I think it's a more general reaction, and I think the context that you're thinking of is this has been true since the dawn of time, like the domestication of animals and the development of agriculture and everything. But you think back to the Industrial Revolution, we suddenly had this productive capacity that we didn't have before, and it reshaped cities. It reshaped the economy and the labor market. And in the early stages, often really to the worst, right? There was a time when the Charles River would, and the Thames in London, they would catch on fire all the time because the pollution was so extreme. And every wave of technology both has some real negative impact along with a positive impact, especially until we're able to, as a society or as a species, figure out how to take advantage of it without the downsides. But it also is just, it's different, and kind of by definition, because people don't like change, because people don't like uncertainty, there's a negative reaction. So it's not to say that it's not warranted, because I think it is in some respects warranted. But you can go back to Plato complaining about written language, saying this is going to destroy people's memories. Why would anyone remember anything if they can write it down? You saw similar reactions in the 19th century to newspapers, to radio, to television, to computers, to the internet, smartphones. They're all kind of analogous conversations. And I think the benefits of those technologies largely have been enormously positive on net. It just takes us some time to figure out how to realize those advantages without the downsides.
You're describing a number of different waves in history, and perhaps we're at another moment where there's an acceleration happening, particularly what people call a new digital transformation. That's been very meaningful to your space, to the business enterprise computing space, and there's been a lot of change in the last few months, and in that space. One company that comes to mind is Zoom. Are you jealous of what Zoom's been able to accomplish over the last few months?
The business results are fantastic. I'm very close to Eric Yuan, the CEO. In fact, I was talking to him earlier this morning and yesterday. Net overall, hugely positive impact on the business. Consumers are, it's very different than enterprise, let's say. Eric sells, or Zoom sells to a large company that has a big internal IT department, and end users inside that company have a problem, they go to IT. They don't go to Zoom. A solo, accountant works all by themselves, decides to start using Zoom with their clients, and they have a problem with their webcam. Who do they ask? They go to Zoom. But the actual consumer behavior is totally different. And having worked in consumer internet before, obviously Flickr and Yahoo more broadly after that, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this, but you get the really disgusting side of human beings when you have that kind of consumer scale, that independent actors, all the spam and the scamming and the phishing and the porn and a lot of tools and analysis that you need in that environment that aren't required in the enterprise business. So I think it presents some new challenges as well. And I think Zoom has been extremely capable in overcoming those, but it's an enormous amount of work and it's an enormous distraction. And I think ultimately you have a vision of what you're trying to accomplish for the product, but just for the business. I'm sure that they have a real roadmap. It's not just what you see today. It's what they're planning for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And I'm sure that they never anticipated birthday parties and happy hours and things like that operating on the same platform. So I'm not jealous of that part of the headaches that come along with it.
Okay, not jealous of Zoom. I want to talk about another player in the space. I think we have to talk about Microsoft. You've said in the past, Microsoft is trying to kill us. Microsoft is something like 100 times the size of Slack as a company. How scared are you of Microsoft?
Not scared. Obviously it's a concern. And I think in the early days, let's say 3-4 years ago, there's a lot of internal conversations of Microsoft did X, so what should we do as a result? And I think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around this, but we should be competitor aware, but customer obsessed. And if we thought that something was a good idea 6 months ago, and now Microsoft does something, should we change what we had planned? We shouldn't, right? Because what would we give up of customer value in order to compete? We should always be doing the thing that customers would want us to be doing. Especially like an ideal, knowledgeable, super rational customer. They'll tell us what they want, and they don't want us wasting energy and time on competition. So you look at this picture of Microsoft in 1977. I don't know if you've ever seen it, when they're still in Albuquerque. It's kind of hippies, and Paul Allen and Bill Gates have long hair. And you think about IBM at the time, the biggest, most valuable, most powerful company in the world, and how Microsoft just snuck past them. But later, how at a time when Microsoft controlled everyone's operating system, controlled all the web browsers in the world, had a huge lead in online services. They bought Hotmail and they had MSN, starting to compete with Google in 2001, 2002, 2003, and spent tens of billions of dollars over the next couple of decades, and were never able to do it, even though they were, they had literally every advantage that you could possibly have. And then I'll keep this short, and you can keep going. But 2007, Google pivoting so hard when they realized that Facebook was getting all this traction, and forcing YouTube commenters to use Google Plus for the first time, and maybe the only time ever, promoting something on their homepage that wasn't the actual search results, leveraging Gmail to get Google Plus usage, and it really made no difference to Facebook. So the lesson we take from that is the small focused startup that has real traction with customers often has an advantage against a large incumbent that has multiple lines of business.
To follow that metaphor or analogy, you believe that you'll be able to sneak past Microsoft?
Yeah. I mean, we have, right? We have 122,000 customers. We just signed Amazon, who I think is the second largest employer. If you look at the top 10 American companies, the majority of them are using Slack. The federal government, but also the governments in Norway and Sweden and the UK and Australia, Canada. Slack has a lot of success in healthcare, in financial services, in retail, enormous enterprises. So, that's what has happened looking backwards. And when we look forwards and you think about the next 3 to 5 years, I think the opportunity is enormous. And there's plenty of room for Microsoft as well. I mean, obviously they're a hugely successful company. The trick, I'm not sure if it's a trick or what, but I guess the thing to keep in mind is if you go back to 1970-ish, like kind of the first wave of real IT inside of companies, from that point to now, from like 1979 when VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet, was released till today, every year companies have spent more money per employee per year on software. Every year, employees have spent more minutes of their day using software. Every year, there's been a larger number of tools in use at a given company. Every year, there's been more software companies in existence and more software companies that have, more than $10 million in revenue, more than $100 million in revenue, more than $1 billion in revenue. All of those, none of those things stopped this year, right? Those are multi-decade long secular trends that will continue for decades to come. And as that happens, I think there's two things. One is the opportunity, the economic opportunity is enormous. But the other thing that's, I think, really interesting is we tend to automate the things, and this is almost tautological, but you automate the things that are most amenable to automation, right? The things that are simplest to automate. And you automate those things where the gap between the performance of the computer and the performance of the human is greatest. So relative to computers, we're terrible at doing arithmetic. Relative to computers, we're terrible at remembering things. So like those are a lot of the first applications of computing technology. Typically, what is going to be automatable is the tasks that are most repetitive, kind of most mind-numbing, in some sense the simplest. And that means that the work that remains for people is actually more demanding of human intelligence and creativity than before. So I think that means it's both harder to perform, but also much harder to manage. I think the challenges that organizations face are kind of compounding in a way that doesn't show up when you're kind of experiencing it day to day, or even looking at the businesses quarter by quarter. But over the course of years, and especially over the course of decades, I think will be really transformative.
Stuart, you tend to take a sort of long historical view. I want to pull back from this moment in history and get your perspective on it. You and your partner, Jennifer Rubio, gave a significant donation to Black Lives Matter and to other social justice causes. What role does a CEO like you and a company like Slack play in terms of advancing equality today?
So first of all, obviously, I have enormous power within Slack, right? So don't have that same power at the national level or the global level. But I think it's really important. I mean, obviously, for inside the company, I think there's an increased awareness that maybe CEOs want to remain apolitical, but you can differ on what counts as a political problem. So I think what we saw, not just with the murder of George Floyd, I mean, that's obviously one thing, but in the weeks that followed, the violence on the side of police towards protesters who were protesting peacefully, towards the media, I think was really shocking and eye-opening. And I mean, you could argue about this, but I don't feel like that's a political issue where there's, one side is the police should beat people with clubs, and that's a reasonable position. And then another position is police shouldn't beat people with clubs, or one position is Black people should be murdered by police regularly. And the other position is that they shouldn't. That's just, it's unacceptable. And I think that the shift that you saw that I believe is really important and will have real impact over the course of history is what counts as acceptable conversation. Like literally, this isn't the most profound example, but one of the things that I've been most kind of heartened by, I guess, in a way, is different brands' Twitter accounts smacking down customers who are responding to their Black Lives Matter statement with "No, they don't," or "All Lives Matter," or something like that. There was one moment where Hulu had posted something in Facebook, just a general statement of solidarity and Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. And one of their customer, or who knows, someone responded saying, well, now you've lost me as a customer and I've talked to 50 of my friends and we're all going to cancel our subscriptions. And the response from Hulu was, thanks for the update from the Klan meeting. That's not something that I think feel like they would have said 3 months ago or a year ago. And what's important about it, I think, is it sets the boundaries of what's acceptable behavior, and it kind of demands something. And if you have a belief that you believe to be common with everyone else, you feel much more supported in that, and you feel much more certain in that belief. If you suddenly realize that no one agrees with you, maybe a natural reaction is to be defensive and dig in, but long term, I think you start to realize if everyone else believes something, that's the opposite of what I believe, maybe I'm wrong. And that's required, and most real progress that we've seen historically has come from a real shift in those boundaries in what's acceptable. Especially in the US today, with the kind of relative weakness at the federal level, it's important that people who are in positions of power, and economic power is one of those dimensions, exercise that power to try to create the social good. I mean, so justice is an enormous component of that. But left to their own devices, I don't think people are bad at all, but we're certainly disorganized, and progress doesn't tend to spontaneously happen. It requires like this input of will. It's not coming from where we have historically expected it to come from. And so I think business leaders, the media, I think religious leaders, people who are in positions of power just broadly have, it's incumbent upon them to try to create social change.
If you could give Silicon Valley a grade on advancing equality, what would that grade be?
I think it's actually better than some of its biggest critics. Because here's what I think we don't always take account. I believe racism is systemic. It doesn't mean that someone designed it and planned everything out, but I do mean that there's a bunch of forces that reinforce each other. No one has a magic force field around their office or their corporate culture. So if Slack exists in a racist society, then there's racism in Slack as well. And when you say that, I think it can be quite shocking to people. Because when they hear racism, they think like a burning cross, or something just outrageous, like using the N-word or something like that. When that's not, obviously that is an extreme expression of racism, but that's not the totality of it. So I don't think that tech companies are free of racism at all. I also don't think that they're, let me put it this way. I think the net impact is good for all but the lowest kind of quartile or lowest decile. And there's more awareness, and technology companies, I think, are quicker to act. And whether that action is motivated by like fear of embarrassment or, true and noble feelings of what people want to accomplish, doesn't really matter as long as the action actually shows up. So, it's trite to say made some progress, long way to go, blah, 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 blah. But I think that it's useful to have some carrot along with a stick, not to make people feel better and not to assuage people, but to really make it clear what you want to happen requires some direction and some encouragement. And when you see something that you don't want to happen, it's fine to criticize it. But I think the blanket statements condemning the technology industry or really any other industry don't have the positive impact that I think those people hope. I think it does motivate people who are fearful of being embarrassed. So maybe at the margins it does, but you really need both.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Slack, Stuart Butterfield, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great conversation.
Thank you, Sam and Stuart Butterfield, for that great conversation. And thanks to all of our guests for being with us on Time 100 Talks today and sharing your thoughts and perspective on the future of business. I'd also like to thank our partners, Citi, for making today's conversations possible. If you'd like more information on Time 100 Talks, past and future, just go to time.com/Time100 Talks. Until next time, thanks for being with us.